Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the bronze medal match from Helsinki Longsword Open about a month ago between Martin Berg and Bart Jongsma. And for the record, the ticker is accurate. Martin's on the left, Bart is on the right. Now, the reason I want to cover this fight isn't just because it's the bronze medal, but because there's a lot of really interesting adaptations centered around hand shots in this fight. Both fencers are landing a lot of hand shots during the course of this entire fight, and both of them have their individual adaptations that they try to make to land their hand shots better and to counter the hand shots of their opponents. And there's a lot of really great tips and great things to learn from in here if you want to level up your own hand shot game or level up your own hand shot defense game. So for our first exchange, we have the normal feeling out period that a lot of fencers do when they first have their first exchange. And in this particular period, it looks like both of the fighters are trying to feel out each other's rhythm and each other's distance before at some point towards the end, they both go in for a hand shot. But they both go for a hand shot in pretty different ways. Bart on the right here goes in for a hand shot over the top in a very traditional manner, whereas Martin on the left goes in for a very horizontal kind of hand shot. Now, it's a little unclear what exactly he was going for because their blades sort of get tangled up in the middle, and frankly, as a hand shot goes, this one isn't a very clear exchange to look at. But what is very important to look at is that one of the reasons that this is so unclear is that they both went for more or less a similar kind of hand shot. When you're fencing in HEMA and you go for a hand shot, often the one thing that you leave open are your own hands. And given that you're going for a hand shot of your own, chances are your hands are also going to be presented into distance as well. Meaning that there's a huge risk factor in going for a hand shot and just getting sniped right back. And in virtually every rule set, regardless of whether or not they punish doubles or not, you generally don't get any points for hitting someone in the hands and then getting hit back. So clearly, both fencers are going to have to adapt to this situation if they want to start landing their hand shots and getting their points. So now, going into our second exchange, we see our first adaptation as far as hand shots go from Martin. He comes forward, walks right into distance, and throws an undercut to the hands. Now, one of the reasons that this is a smart adaptation isn't just the fact that he's throwing a hand shot from a different angle than before, but specifically, it counters the kinds of guards that he is seeing from his opponent, and frankly, that he's standing in himself. Now, both of these fencers are standing with their right leg forward and their hands kind of in a thumb grip in a kind of plow position. And what that means is that their cross guard is sitting parallel directly on top of their hands. So one of the ways that you use this position in order to defend your hands, specifically from cuts from above, is to take your sword and go from pointing it forward to pointing it up. This is generally what's considered a cron position. While it's technically significantly lower than a cron is said to be in the books, the point of this is that by pointing your tip up into the air, you make your horizontal crossguard move upwards, and it does a really great job of pushing out of the way anything that's coming downward. By throwing an undercut, a cut that comes from the low to the high towards the hands, it is perfect for countering this particular position because it makes sure that you can hit the hands of your opponent in the opposite direction that they're trying to defend. And more importantly, after you land your cut, as we see here, you can end up in certain positions where you have a really great ability to defend yourself from any cut that comes from above as well, albeit from a different kind of position. As you see when Martin lands his cut, he's kind of almost in a really, really low ox position, and all he has to do is shift his hands off to one side to make sure that his blade is sitting directly in front of all of his openings at that distance and get safely out of the exchange. A really nice adaptation, and one where if you're looking to try to land some really good hand snipes of your own, try throwing undercuts. But of course, this just means that Bart is going to have to adapt around this particular kind of hand shot if he's going to start being successful. So next up, we have another really cool adaptation, but one that isn't actually an adaptation to anything that has happened yet. And in a lot of ways, it's a really great demonstration of why this low plow into crons kind of situation can be really beneficial, not just for throwing cuts, but for throwing thrusts. So what happens here is that Martin and Bart are kind of going back and forth, shuffling their feet and trying to stay out of range to try to get the other person to commit heavily. And in this particular instance, Martin throws out a probing cut. When I say probing cut, I mean a cut that's really not intending to land, but is intending to provoke a reaction from their opponent that they can hopefully parry riposte and get the better of. However, in this particular situation, Martin throws that probing cut. It lands right into that hesitant little cron that Bart does. Immediately feeling that pressure upon his blade, though, Bart throws a thrust out of that situation and manages to land it. Now, the reason this works out for him is two particular reasons. One, a probing strike, no matter how uncommitted it is, still requires you to move forward a little bit. And that little bit of forward motion means that in order to get back out of range, you have to do a little bit of backwards motion. So when someone throws a probing cut and you do manage to parry it, you do have an opportunity there to try to respond. However, it's a very, very small opportunity. And one of the difficulties of using this opening that people give you with their probing cuts is that if you throw something big and something committed, that's often the kind of reaction that they were hoping to get out of you. If you throw a really big committed thrust or a really big committed cut to the head, chances are they're going to be able to recover so quickly that they are going to parry riposte you and you're going to end up looking like a fool. So what Bart here does is really, really intelligent. By throwing a very quick and not very overcommitted thrust, he's able to close that distance, but at the same time not go so far past his opponent that if he does end up missing, he's going to be in a situation where he can get easily zverked to the head. So a really great response, one that wasn't necessarily guaranteed to land, but it also speaks very quickly to how well you can transition from parrying to thrusting in this particular guard position. So if you're looking to try to protect your hands from hand strikes, try to take a page out of Bart's book here. Look to try to do tiny little crons and tiny little displacing parries and then immediately follow them up with a thrusting action. This can be a really great way to put pressure on your opponent when they don't want to be putting a lot of pressure on you. Now, this next exchange is actually almost identical to the one previous, but it doesn't actually result in any points, at least until the very end. And what happens here is basically a attempted adaptation from Martin based on the previous exchange that doesn't really work out for him. Instead of going forward with the probing strike that he did last time, he instead throws a feinted cut. And as you can see here, the response from Bart is almost identical. He does his tiny little croning motion, and upon realizing that no attack is coming, immediately throws that thrust out. And this is a really, really smart game plan from Bart here, because in this particular rule set, you get 3 points for a deep target and 2 points for none. And at the end of the day, oftentimes after blowing somebody to a deep target is a great way to make sure that you always get the better of an exchange, even in one where you manage to get hit on the hands by, say, an undercut. So here, despite the fact that Martin already kind of has the blueprints for defeating these mini crons that Bart is constantly doing, Bart is going to keep doing them because his pre-programmed response every single time he throws one of these little crons is to throw a thrust immediately after. And the thing is that while it may be easy to defend yourself from a cut after you land an undercut of your own, it's pretty difficult to defend yourself a thrust because when your hands are low, your entire upper openings are open and you have to cross from the low area where you hit all the way across the top in order to make sure that you can't just get stabbed in the face. So the sequence goes, Bart throws his thrust, it doesn't actually quite reach its target, Martin goes out into a hanging parry, manages to try to parry and then respond and then parry another response cut, and the whole exchange just kind of resets. After it resets, they both walk into each other's range, Bart goes for a hand shot. It looks like Martin was actually probably trying to go for a hand shot of his own, but due to the fact that they both walked into each other, Martin ends up landing into the body and then turning it into a thrust rather than just cutting into the hands, resulting in a 1 point differential for Martin. It's also a pretty good demonstration of why, if you don't defend your lower openings quite well enough, you can still be thrusted into the body, as something that it too, from the gold medal match, would certainly be willing to do. So at this point in the fight, Bart still has a pretty nice lead, but it's not one that's completely unable to be overcome. And during this next sequence, what happens here is that Bart is looking to increase his lead to that point where it's just unrecoverable. And he's going to do this by throwing a whole lot of hand strikes. Now, as you watch this sequence perform, what happens here is that Bart basically does the same thing about 3 or 4 times in a row. He takes a little step forward, he throws a hand cut, he watches Martin parry it, and then he waits and sees what Martin does after. And the real key difference that you want to pay attention to here is that the reason Bart is able to constantly move forward and constantly throw his hand strikes is because Martin does not have the same pre-programmed response that Bart does whenever he parries one of these hand strikes. If you remember from the previous 2 exchanges, every single time that Bart felt pressure or even no contact on his blade, every single time he did his little cron and he realized that he wasn't getting hit, he threw his thrust as a response. This was a very, very good thing to do. If Martin had this same pre-programmed response, chances are Bart would not have been able to get away with throwing so many hand strikes in a row. So if you want to learn from this, one of the things to learn here is that you need pre-programmed responses every single time you either get a parry or you get a successful void, either because your opponent misses or because they just didn't throw at all. And you need to be able to push the pressure and the pace of the fight by constantly throwing counterattacks, even if you know they're not going to land. Because at the end of the day, you never know whether or not your opponent is going to throw one hand strike into another hand strike, into another hand strike, knowing that your defensive posture means that they can throw as many attacks as they like, and they will receive no threat in return. This is not the situation that you want to be in. Now, Martin does have an adaptation for these hand strikes. It's just not the kind of thing that Bart has. What he has instead is a try to attempt of timing. Now, one of the things about coming in and throwing hand strikes over and over is that you have to move forward that little bit. Now, as we said earlier, one of the things about moving forward is that you eventually have to move backwards. But there's another aspect of timing that you can utilize to try to catch somebody who's constantly going forward and going for low priority targets, and that is to just full send something straight at their head or chest. The reason this can be a good idea is that A, if you get lucky and they were throwing a kind of feinted, rather non-committal hand strike, chances are you're going to hit them in the head or the chest, and they're not really going to hit you back. But in most rule sets, even if they do hit you in the target that they intended to hit you at, the hands or the leg, your ballistic thrust to the head or chest is going to grant you 3 points versus their 1 or their 2, and it's going to result in a point differential for you. So it can be a really great idea to try to time when your opponent is coming forward, go forward yourself, and utilize the fact that you're closing distance so rapidly that they're not going to be able to pull out of whatever they were attempting to do. However, in this particular case, it looks like Martin misread the situation ever so slightly, and Bart was throwing his thrust of his own at the exact same time, resulting in them skewering each other. Now, this next exchange is really short, but it's not actually all that simple. Martin comes in and goes for another one of his undercut hand shots, and as far as I can tell, it does appear to mostly land. But at the exact same time, Bart comes over the top and lands a hand shot of his own. And one of the interesting aspects of this is that what I talked about earlier was Martin's undercut hand shots really are trying to achieve two things. One, take advantage of the fact that Bart keeps going up into a cron and exposing his lower hands, and two, trying to parry an afterblow of a hand cut over the top. And in this case, he fails at both of those. And one of the reasons I think he fails in this particular instance is that when he goes for his undercut, he shortens his motion so much as to almost look as though he is throwing the flat of his blade forward and doing an entirely vertical hand shot cut that goes straight up into the air. The reason you might do this is because you're focusing so much on parrying the afterblow that you're kind of almost shortcutting a little bit of the rotation of the cut to the hands. When you're throwing a cut to the hands, you want to make sure that you're extending and really making that good sweeping motion up at a 45-degree angle. And the reason for that is that it covers the most horizontal and vertical distance to ensure that no matter what hand position your opponent happens to be in when you land your cut, it's going to be a cut. In this particular sequence, what happens is because Bart is coming forward at the exact same time, Martin clearly didn't expect it, he ends up shortcutting his cut portion so much so that it almost looks like he flats the bottom of the hands and then just spends the entire time trying to parry the afterblow, which he is unsuccessful in doing. As a result, while I don't necessarily agree with it, I can completely understand why the judges call this a shot for Bart and nothing from Martin, because at the end of the day, Martin had taken so much of the sting out of his own hand shot that it became almost invisible to the judges. Now, again, for our next sequence, we have the exact same scenario play out, albeit through a larger exchange. Both fencers spend a lot more time moving in and out of each other's range, but at the end of the day, the result is the same. Martin throws an undercut, Bart throws an overcut, and they both hit each other in the hands. And one of the things about this is that Martin's adaptation for these undercuts to the hands only really works if he is the first one to throw the cut, and as a result gets a little bit of a tempo where he can then transition from landing his cut to trying to parry the afterblow. As I said in the beginning, one of the aspects of trying to throw these hand shots from a different direction is that it helps with countering the obvious intentional problem of throwing a hand shot to begin with, namely that throwing a hand shot means that your own hands are open. And in this, what we get is a little bit of a better understanding of that situation overall. What we understand here is that pretty much no matter what kind of hand shot you throw, if you throw it at the exact same time as another person's hand shot, your ability to defend yourself is still basically zero. What you have to make sure of is that you have to know exactly when your opponent is going to be throwing these hand shots, and you have to make a conscious decision to either move out of the way or parry them, and then throw your afterblow after that. The idea here is that if both people are unwilling to cede the motion that their hand shots are going to land and then you can parry afterwards, they're just going to end up hitting each other in the hands over and over again, as we're seeing here. So next up, we have another adaptation from Bart, but it's a very, very strange looking one that a lot of people might not understand on just first viewing. The principle at play here is what, at the very least, I believe Stephen Chaney refers to as lengthening the strike, but I'll call the Dark Souls maneuver. And if you ever played like a video game where you have to kind of time a parry or time a roll or dodge or something like that, one of the most frustrating things that can happen to you is that the enemy does this big wind up strike that takes so long that you actually end up getting into your own head and doing your defensive action prematurely. And that's exactly the same principle at play here. Martin comes forward with what appears to be just a very basic, slow, and very non-committal casting cut that he lengthens and lengthens and lengthens by furthering his foot forward and furthering the motion of his arms to the point where it comes out so slow that it looks completely unintimidating. As a result, though, because it looks so unintimidating, Martin doesn't do any real response. He simply backs up and waits for it to miss so that he can probably throw something of his own. He's concentrating so heavily on what he's going to do after he dodges that he doesn't end up dodging. And the reason he doesn't end up dodging is because Bart here was throwing something so slow and so methodical that he was essentially waiting the entire time he was throwing his cut to see what his opponent would do. And when he realized he wasn't going to do anything, just lengthened and lengthened and lengthened the distance and the time of his attack until Martin stopped moving, at which point he could land it to the hands. Now, of course, it does appear that it hit in the grip, right between Martin's hands, but I will agree with the judges here. At the end of the day, you have to call this a hand strike regardless of whether or not it actually ended up hitting the hands, because no one's actually good enough at longsword to parry with the middle of their grip on purpose. So our next exchange and our next adaptation is one of distance and timing. So you're going to want to really pay attention to the feet on this one. What happens here is that Bart throws another one of his casting hand shots that doesn't look like it has any real commitment. And you can confirm it doesn't have any real commitment because if you watch his feet during the exchange, they don't go anywhere. They don't go forward. And normally, without moving forward, your ability to hit someone in the hands is fairly limited, given that most of the time people fence from just outside distance, meaning that you have to do something to close that little bit of distance, otherwise you won't be in range. But given the fact that Martin is able to get a fairly meaty parry off of this means that they were actually, in fact, both in range of each other before this exchange started. And this is the adaptation that I think Martin really excels at, given that he loves to sit, instead of just outside of range, just inside of range and fights from what a boxing term would call inside the pocket. The idea being that you're in a distance where both people can hit each other. You have to completely rely on your blade work and not necessarily your footwork to keep you safe and or hit your target. So Bart throws his hand shot. He doesn't move his feet forward. He gets parried, and then Martin is able to throw a counter strike straight to the hands, again without moving his feet forward. The only reason this is possible is because they were already in range when the exchange started. So if you're looking to duplicate something like this, what you want to try to make sure you do is you have a really, really tight understanding of where your opponent has their distance trigger set at. What I mean by that is that a lot of people, when you enter their range, are going to have a pre-programmed response to just try to get you to go away. Because at the end of the day, if you enter range and you don't throw an attack, it might be considered a little bit of a problem. Bart's pre-programmed response here was to throw one of these casting hand shots, and what Martin effectively did was he walked into that range, stood there, knowing that he knew what kind of attack was going to come, parried it, and responded it so quickly that he was able to hit it before Bart was able to retreat out of distance, which is clearly what he was going to try to do after he tried to throw this hand strike. It's a really, really tight and really subtle adaptation, but one that is very, very effective if you know how to pull it off. So at this point, things are tied 7-7, and as you can see by the clock, we're getting towards the end of time. These fights only run to 3 minutes no matter what, and they generally will call a last exchange in the last 10 seconds, which means that at best, you will have maybe 1 or 2 more exchanges out of this fight. And in this particular section, and just make 100% sure that you understand, the camera has flipped at this point. So the idea here is that Martin is going to go for another one of his really good undercuts to the hands. And when you watch this happen, it looks like it's executed almost perfectly. They walk forward into range. Bart signals that he's going to throw some kind of attack, but kind of hesitates for a second. And then Martin throws something of his own. And Bart does exactly what he's done every single time up till now, which is go into his cron. So he was in a perfect position to just get smacked right on the hands with this undercut. And the camera kind of obscures it. I cannot genuinely tell whether or not this strike lands, because whether or not it lands depends entirely on whether or not it is before or after the crossguard. If it's in front of the crossguard, well, then it hit nothing but blade and it hit nothing. But if it's behind the crossguard, it probably hit a little bit of crossguard and a little bit of grip, which means that it should have been counted as a hand shot. I just can't tell. However, what happens is that the judges don't call it, and Martin, who clearly thought that he did land it, hesitates for a moment. And this is a clear opportunity that Bart seizes on immediately. The second he realizes that the judges have not declared that his hands have been hit, he pulls out of the position that he's in and throws a cut around to the side, which Martin, who has hesitated just a second too long, is unable to parry, and he gets hit in the hands. So, going from a 7-7, it is now 9-7, and we are basically about to enter final exchange. So it's final exchange, and Bart has the lead, which means that normally he would go into a little bit of a defensive mood. But in this particular case, he goes full offensive and basically commits himself to a hand shot. And in terms of the game, in terms of how to win this particular fight, it does make a lot of sense. Hitting someone in a low priority target is a pretty easy thing to do. And given this rule set, the worst outcome that can happen, as long as you manage to hit your target, is that they hit you in a deep target and they get 1 point. 1 point, which of course at this point would not be enough for Martin to win. Martin needs a clean 3 points in order to win. But he has a pretty smart game plan to try to make it. Seeing that Bart is coming forward aggressively, Martin goes into a little bit of a defensive stance, and with the second Bart throws his hand shot, Martin gets a pretty nice looking parry. Now, the judges rule that this managed to hit the hands, and again, I can't tell for sure, but what is very clear is that after Martin gets what he thinks is a good parry, he goes for his own version of what Bart had been doing to him earlier. He parries, and then he immediately throws a thrust in. The problem is that this thrust appears to miss. And the reason it misses is because when Bart came forward, he came forward with his left foot forward rather than his right foot forward. And the reason that's important is because when your left foot forward is forward, your left arm is also forward. What happens here is that Bart throws his cut, he took his full step, his left arm is the one that's forward, so when Martin throws his thrust, instead of going in towards the chest here, it glances off of the top of the arm and skitters off to the side. Martin parried on his right side, so he actually went a little outside the line to throw his parry, and then when he came in, he had to cross from the outside a little bit towards the inside, and that arm was sitting right there in the middle. It's a really difficult situation to be in, and it's one where it's completely understandable that that thrust would have missed. It's also completely understandable that it might have hit, but it would have certainly hit the arm and not the chest that obviously Martin was really hoping to hit. So, despite what everything happens here, in my opinion, as long as the judges were pretty sure about that cut from Bart landing, which it does look like it definitely could have landed, the response thrust from Martin really doesn't matter whether it lands or not, because it definitely doesn't land on the correct target, and even if it had, in this particular case, he would have only gotten 1 point and still lost the match. It's a very disappointing way to end the fight overall, but it is one that really shows you the power of adaptation when it comes to hand shots. The fact that Martin had a very clear path to victory at the end here by doing something that Bart had done to him previously was a very, very good game plan that just happened to not quite work out. And it could have been really, really exciting if Martin had managed to parry that cut, thrusted his opponent in the chest, gotten 3 clean points, and won in what was essentially, based on this rule set, an almost impossible comeback to make, given that all that Bart had to do was land something, and he would have managed to win. But Bart did land something, and he did win, and it was declared 2 clean points for him, so he ended up winning 11-7, which, as an end score, kind of betrays how close this fight was really the entire time. But it was, of course, a really good fight, and on Thursday, I'm hoping to review another fight from Helsinki, so if you're looking forward to that, come on back, and I'll have another one for you then.